Everybody, I am Brian Murray, and I direct the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability, one of the co-hosts with Fuqua today of the summit. This has really been an energizing day so far, and we're going to be energized further by Antha Williams. Antha leads the environment program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and her team efforts are in sustainable cities, oceans and fisheries, and understanding climate-related financial risks and opportunities. So really a perfect person to talk to us about that. You know, we've heard a lot in this catalyst movement, if you will, about the movement of public finance to private capital, and philanthropy plays a unique role. They sort of have some, public interest elements to what they do, of course, and I think we're going to hear that their catalyst story is a little bit different. It's a little bit more targeted and probably like chemical reactions itself, just maybe not always easy to predict, but a lot to learn from. So Antha, welcome to Duke.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit more about yourself and Bloomberg.
Yeah, well, I'm so delighted to be here, and I really agree. It's been an energizing day already, so it's a pleasure to be here at Duke, and really appreciate the conference organizers for having the vision and foresight to put this together, Ronnie and the team here. I already feel like I'm making little notes and picking up ideas that I'll take home. I'm based in New York City. I've been with Bloomberg Philanthropies for about 10 years. I joined Bloomberg Philanthropies when Mike was in his final term as mayor of New York and was beginning to really think more and ramp up what was happening at Bloomberg Philanthropies. And at that time, based on his 3 terms as mayor, of course, local solutions were really front and center in terms of what we could do as a philanthropy. And he was very much of the mind, having worked as the chief executive of our city, that philanthropy has a unique role to play in proving what's possible, taking some risky bets, doing some things that elected officials might not feel comfortable using taxpayer money on when they're not quite proven to work. And so that's a really important place for philanthropy. So that was kind of one of our sort of starting points and tent poles. And we really got into the climate work on the basis of, how do we take the work that Mike was doing on sustainability in New York City and spread it with other cities? Some of the best things he did were really, he would say, stolen from other places where mayors were taking bold action. But then second was he did a lot of work and actually some innovative finance to get the most polluting home heating oil out of New York City buildings. At that time, buildings were the major contributor to our air pollution problem, and cleaning that single problem up led us to have the cleanest air we've had in 50 years in New York City. And that was something where there were elements that he was able to just take from what was happening in other cities rather than kind of connect them with whole cloth, and that have since been taken up lots of other places. But as a result of that work to clean up New York City's air, really saw that we could not get where we needed to go, even setting aside climate change, even on the air pollution problem, when we were getting all this pollution blown over from coal-fired power plants in other places. And so that was what led him to in 2010, when legislation, cap and trade legislation withered on the vine in the U.S. Senate, while a lot of environmental and climate groups were saying, let's go focus on other countries and do other things, the Sierra Club came to Mike with an idea that was, we can actually target coal-fired power plants and close them down. And so the work to get off of coal, which was, at the time pretty radical for a sitting mayor to put their finger on coal. It was kind of a third rail in politics, and certainly even in UN conversations, people were not talking about, coal as something we needed to absolutely get out of. But to launch that campaign and our environmental work on global now energy transition and cities and sustainable finance and oceans has really grown from there.
Yeah. Well, several people in the room and I were really actively involved in the cap and trade policy issues of the late 2000s and 2010, and it was a moment of reckoning for a lot of organizations about what to do next. And I think a lot of organizations ended up sort of wandering in the wilderness and taking a while to figure it out. And so I think it was absolutely fantastic timing for Bloomberg and the philanthropies to step in and play the role that they did. So maybe step back a little bit more and just like looking at what is the Bloomberg Philanthropy and LP basic strategy for tackling climate change.
Yeah. So Bloomberg Philanthropies is the philanthropic arm, and Bloomberg LP is the data and financial services company. And because it was really designed to provide real-time market data for financial markets and decision makers, data is sort of a core part of how we think about the work. So when I think about our cross-cutting climate work, I really think about sort of filling three gaps. The first is the data gap, the second is the action gap, and the third is the investment gap. And the gaps around data, I think, are pretty clear. We never think about data for its own sake, but it's like, what is material, decision useful data? And so things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which Mary Shapiro chairs, former SEC chair, very experienced regulator and climate advocate and expert, has led to financial disclosures that have been adopted, across Europe and now are on the cusp of being adopted here. And so that kind of just provide the data for useful decision making, I think, is an important step number one. Going back to the coal campaign, I think it's interesting. When we started that work, there was some activist enthusiasm, but actually not a lot of data. And so one thing that we paid for was the first ever boiler by boiler model of all the coal plants in the US, where they sit, what they cost, the cost of, the status of the pollution controls that are on those boilers. And that has really served as the sort of baseline for campaigning here, and now the model for how the campaign was launched when it launched in 2016 in Europe as the Beyond Coal campaign, and now other places like Australia and South Korea and Japan where there are sister campaigns. So data is really kind of a basic gap that we always think about and need to fill. On the action gap, as one example, we do a lot of work to help governments adopt policies and programs that are going to be provide the long tail of the change that we need. And so air pollution, as I mentioned, is an important issue that we do a lot of work on. And so in places like, as varied as India and Warsaw and Milan, states across India, Maharashtra was the first one, but Warsaw and Milan and London and cities across the US, we've paid for low-cost, locally created air quality sensors. That's the data piece, but then you actually have to do the source apportionment work and then the sort of technical work to figure out the policies and programs that are going to tackle those sources of pollution. So that's something that we just launched across 10 new cities around the world as part of the Breathe Cities initiative, and that's just an example of the, once you have the data, how do you really take action? And then the final gap is to the conversation here today about investment, I think. And philanthropy money alone is never going to be sufficient for the kind of change that we need. I mean, even at the level of giving that we're doing at Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is quite substantial, we're talking about the conversation this morning on IRA funding, $369 billion. Those are not the kind of numbers that you get to with private philanthropy. So it's really about, as you said, being a catalyst, and how can philanthropy unlock increasing government funding and private funding. And so one example on that is at the climate COP in Dubai, we brought mayors from mega cities around the world, about 500 local leaders that actually came to a local climate action summit with the Secretary General. And one of the really fun, I don't know if it was fun for everyone, but I thought it was fun, was these mayors and governors from around the US did a roundtable with John Podesta, and they were like, here's the issues with the IRA. We're having trouble getting this. And he's a very thoughtful person, as we all saw, and very responsive. But kind of heard where are some of the gaps and what do we need to realign to try to make this money more available for the kinds of programs, the uptake of the kinds of programs and technologies that we're all talking about with the IRA. So there were other examples where those mayors then aggregated their projects around issues like ports decarbonization. You know, how do you pay for the vehicles? How do you pay for the infrastructure? Those deals alone to the private sector might look too small or too risky in a certain geography, but in aggregate, they can actually attract quite a lot of investment. And so those are some of the ways that we think about filling those gaps.
It's great. I mean, we heard this morning from the corporate panel about essentially how to operate within your core competencies and expand your core competencies. And what you just described about the link between actually Michael Bloomberg himself as a mayor and his organization, LP, to the Philanthropies, it's like really strong alignment, right? It's based on data, it's based on political movement to some extent, and based on finance. And so that, I mean, I think that speaks to the effectiveness of the organization. So, step back, what are some of the big bets that we should be making on climate right now? Well, I'll talk a little bit about maybe in the next round about what specific role philanthropy can play. But you're an expert too, just on climate change more generally. So there are other sources of capital in the room too that could be probably learned from the wisdom that you have gained in that regard. So.
Well, I'm interested in what your answer to that question would be, Brian, because your team has done really important work, I think, on some of these just energy transition platforms, for example. Some of the policy barriers to being able to drive more investment that are I think, really important and time-limited opportunities to get right. So I'll turn that back on you in a minute. But I think, make your notes. This is primarily a U.S. conversation here, and I think one of the things that became really apparent to us as we supported first Sierra Club and then a lot of state and local organizations. I know there's David's here from the Southern Environmental Law Center. There's people from a number of NGO partners and groups who've been very involved in the coal fight. And a couple interesting things happened in the phases of the coal fight. First, I think in 2011, in that sort of moment of hopelessness, 2010, 2011, moment of sort of hopelessness about like, will we ever get climate legislation in this country or not, and what are we going to do in the meantime? It was really significant to have a robust movement come together to just say coal is the most polluting form of fuel on Earth, which it remains, the leading cause of global pollution. We've got to end coal in this country, and getting that done by 2030 is a really significant contribution. At the same time, the science has come in that gas is not an effective bridge fuel off of coal. And so at the same time that we're retiring all of that coal, we have to make sure that it's not replaced by polluting gas. And I think a lot of those same organizations have been quite effective in that regard. But in about 2019, 2020, a number of our partners, including Earth Justice, as well as a lot of local groups, especially in Texas and the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, came to us and said, we're having a lot of success in cutting the pollution from these coal-fired power plants, and in some cases gas. But the next big threat, what we're seeing everywhere, is these fossil fuel companies coming in and saying they're going to use fracked gas to make plastics. And this was a big and increasing fight around petrochemicals. And it was basically, we saw on the investment side, companies going to their shareholders and saying, our market share may be going down in power generation because of wind and solar, and in transportation because of electric vehicles and transit, but don't worry, our future looks bright. We're gonna keep growing, and we're gonna use this product to make throwaway plastics. And so it's an issue that's really sat at the center of environmental health and justice, because just like a coal plant emits carbon, but also particulate matter that causes respiratory illness and disease and death, these plants emit the carbon plus a bunch of endocrine disrupting toxic chemicals that cause horrible birth defects and reproductive problems and everything else. So it sits at the nexus of environmental health and justice, the climate fight, and the scourge of plastic pollution, that at the same time our oceans partners were coming to us and saying this is a really huge problem. So a number of those groups came together and formed the Beyond Petrochemicals campaign. It's really focused in just 5 states where the majority of these facilities are slotted to be built. And it's had some enormous success in blocking some of these polluting facilities and making sure that there are alternative, jobs and economic pathways in those regions.
So agree on both those points. We actually, our institute helped form a plastics pollution working group across Duke that have people from, every School of the Environment, obviously people working on oceans, but also people in the School of Medicine and School of Nursing, focused on this issue for endocrine disruptors. So we do think that that's a growth area. The just energy transitions, launching some work in low and middle income countries, where the rate of return can be very high, but the access to capital is very, very low, right? So it doesn't help that it's a 15% rate of return if you actually can't get the capital to begin with. So how do you expedite that transition? But one thing I want to talk about, because I know it's also in your portfolio, and people have stopped me in the hallway and in the stairs here and said, this is really a great event. How about, why aren't you doing more about nature-based solutions at this event? I mean, we're doing a lot at Duke in that space. And so a lot of this has been on the energy transition, but there are also some tremendous investments that can be made. And I think one of the reasons I want to tee that back up to you is because then I think that does lead into the next discussion about what role can philanthropy play that is really kind of unique in this space. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. To your point about the just energy transition platforms, I couldn't agree more. I think those are critical platforms, and there's a really important role for philanthropy in that, we know that a country like Indonesia needs to and has a huge opportunity to move to a renewable energy economy and get out of polluting coal. But they have an awful lot of existing coal plants and coal contracts and costs and rates that are associated with that, and a huge social transition that's going to happen. I mean, the same is true in South Africa. There's 200,000 people whose jobs are directly tied to coal. And that's not going to be, the transition, training, workforce development, reemployment, economic development for those people is not in the short term going to be a matter for private capital and profit. I mean, there just has to be a sort of government role, and philanthropy can play a really important role, I think, in creating some of the systems and models for how that can happen. So things like workforce exchanges or training programs. In Appalachia, we've supported some really innovative public-private partnerships to spin off new profit-making businesses in energy communities that no longer have the kind of jobs that they once did coming from the fossil fuel industry. So I think that can be a really important role, the sort of social elements, and proving what's possible for philanthropy to play. On nature-based solutions, it's interesting. You and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, but I think the conversation is critically important. We do a ton of oceans work, and I'm lucky enough in my job that I'm a scuba diver, and a lot of the people who are working in these amazing places to protect oceans like to actually take you out into the water and see what they've protected. So I just got back from visiting some of those amazing pristine sites that have been very effective in their protection in Palau a couple weeks ago. And they have these amazing success stories where the bumphead parrotfish, which are those very charismatic, you probably have all seen them, they're like the size of cars and they have this huge bump on their head. They were fished almost to extinction in Palau. And the government passed a policy that they needed to be protected. And, it's actually turns out nature is quite resilient. It's hard to kill the last fish in the ocean. So if you do the right stuff, they will come back, and they did. And talk about the connections across nature. A single one of those fully mature fish creates 5.5 tons of sand a year. A single fish creates 5.5 tons of sand a year because they chomp on dead coral or rocks or other things, and they make sand. So you think about reefs full of these fish creating sand, shoring up the reef, creating climate resilience. It's like a pretty incredible story. So I think the trick is figuring out, again, to the gaps around data and action and investment. There's a lot of lines down that chain where we can play a role to create the evidence base, create the policies that are going to work to enable protection, and then drive the investment to make it happen.
All right, I got to be a scuba diver now. So, yeah.
I recommend.
So, philanthropy and climate finance. up until recently, I think I was reading a World Economic Forum report that climate finance, only about 0.1% of all climate finance was coming from philanthropy, and only, say, 2% of all private philanthropy was focused on climate. That's changed a lot in the last couple of years, and I think Bloomberg has been the clear leader in that space. What is it? So what is the value, what is the unique role that philanthropy can play in kind of catalyzing this movement of capital?
It's a really good question. I think one of the things that we do in thinking about our philanthropy is look for unmet needs. And to your point about the sort of starkness of the numbers, and you've done work in some of these low and middle income countries, but you look at the continent of Africa, and while there's 60% of the world's solar potential for solar energy, there's well under 1% of total clean energy investment is happening there. And some of that is because what you hear is that the projects are too small or the market is too risky. Some of the problems and the barriers in that space are related to climate. You know, it's hard to know if you're an under-resourced government where you put the project, how to get the first gigawatt in place, like what you do. And so philanthropy can play an important role in finding the experts who are on the ground, based in countries, who can do that kind of technical work, show where you site a project, connect the right developer to the people who are going to do the permit, all those things that you might take for granted in a market like the US. So that's sort of part one. I think part two is there are a bunch of barriers that are outside the walls of the climate problem that are currency exchange problems or other financial market problems. And that's one of the things I think is exciting about this conversation about bringing together the climate experts at the Nicholas Institute with the business experts to have the conversation, because to your earlier point, if you're looking to invest capital and it costs 5% to get a project going here and 20% if you want to get it going in Senegal, then which are you going to choose? So we have to figure out ways where we're supporting and in a quite timely and quick way, because part of this is about the market is moving there, but it's a matter of how fast it's going to go. To just do the technical work, the project design, connecting and convening the right people to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people when they talk about philanthropy, they say, well, how can it scale? And it seems to me like in some cases they pick projects that isn't necessarily the goal, right? The project itself isn't supposed to scale, but the way that it works with the other stacks of capital do scale. Can you say something about that? Is that something that you think about when you figure out what to invest in?
I think we do, for sure. I think we also view each, we work a lot on policy, and that's really, key to our approach. We're also, I would say, not afraid of controversial issues, and we try to always stay nimble to respond to what the immediate need is. I think a strength of our approach has been a recognition that each country and market is really different. So it's pretty rare that we try to find the experts who are, based in New York City who come and, tell the market in Senegal or South Africa how it ought to work. But rather to find people who are working in that market and try to scale up what they're able to do. And in some cases, the network of key decision makers can be a big difference maker in this. So I used the example of mayors earlier, but it is significant that if you can get in a mega city, the mayor really bought into an agenda. I mean, they are the executive of their city. A lot can happen. It's very different than just having a conversation at the sort of sustainability director level. So with that buy-in, then they, steal solutions and then work together. And we've seen a lot of cases, like the city's GAP fund is an example where we've really effectively been able to work with governments to pool public funding with philanthropy and to attract private capital to begin to get some of these projects around electric buses in Latin American cities, for example, up and off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, large cities seem to be like a perfect laboratory for kind of being about the right size to actually get things done, right? Like it's more solutions oriented, and you don't, the ratio of need for accomplishment and political turmoil is probably a better balance than at higher levels. So.
Yeah, and it's one of the cool things about my job that when I go to these mega cities, it's like partly I'm going just as a, somebody who enjoys traveling and being there, but partly it's like as a practitioner. So when I was in Mexico City around Christmas, it was like, wow, what they've done with bus rapid transit, if any of you have been there recently, it's quite incredible. A very low-cost way compared to building a whole rail line to cut air pollution, to get working people to their jobs quickly and efficiently, to cut down traffic. And I mean, it's quite a remarkable thing that they've done with that specific change, which was really learning quickly from other cities in Latin America, including how to get the investment to make it happen.
Right. Well, we're close to wrapping up, and so I'd like you to close your eyes and project back a little while ago to your days at the other D university that you went to, at Dartmouth College. And we have a diverse audience here, including a lot of students. And if you could kind of think, either retravel those years or think about if you were at Dartmouth right now, figuring out how to have the tremendously rewarding career that you've had, what kind of advice would you give either to your old self or to the versions of you that are in the audience right now?
Well, it's a nice question. If I wasn't doing what I am doing, I think I would have been a field biologist, would have been my different path, but I kind of found activism and campaigns. And, we've talked a lot about politics and durability in the conversations throughout the day. I think there's no training like campaigns for just how to be effective, how at a relatively new level of experience you can work hard, gain enormous responsibility and authority, and really learn how to make quick decisions and get things done. So I really recommend to the young people in my life to figure out a way, whether it's volunteering or it's full-time work, to get experience on campaigns, whether those are political campaigns or issue-based, environmental campaigns or other things. I think there's really no substitute for that.
So that's a way to get durability going. And again, that was a
pass
good
policy, get the right decision makers in place. And
it was well used by Bloomberg back in 2010 when we were talking about when the roadblock was hit, and then about 5 or 6 years ago when things in Washington looked like they were slowing down a bit. So anyway, I can't believe it, but it is time. And thank you so much,
Thank you.
Antha, for being with us.